Okay, great. Thank you, JP. And thank you, Congressman Pittenger, for inviting me. It's terrific to be here with you all and alongside these great colleagues. I'm Steve Kitay, and the bottom line that I hope that you walk away with is that there are tremendous changes that are happening in space. And space is not only important to scientific achievement when you're thinking about NASA, the moon and Mars and exploration, but it's for security and economic reasons. And they're intertwined in many ways, from technologies to workforces to global impacts. Space is inherently global. There is no sovereignty in space. There's not sovereign regions as there is with airspace and on land. It's a global resource. Now, my remarks will focus on the commercial aspects, but I'd like to reflect back on the changes over the past decade or so, and one of those major changes you've heard touched on already, and it was the establishment of the Space Force. And I think it's important to take a moment to talk a little bit more about that as in some ways a case study, recognizing that many of you are parliamentarians or impacting policy in some way or other. And the establishment of the Space Force was a journey, and it took leadership from many places. And I think that the most important thing is to recognize the power of an idea and the power of a team. And when I say the power of an idea, Scott had talked about there was many questions, and when the Space Force was being debated on why do we need it? And that's a great question. That is the fundamental question when wrestling something as significant as this. As Scott had mentioned, the creation of a new armed force in the United States hasn't happened since 1947, 70 years ago. So when senior policymakers were debating it, that was the biggest question to understand, is why. And personally, I was part of that process here up on Capitol Hill. I previously worked for the House Armed Services Committee for Congressman Mike Rogers from 2011 to 2017 when they were looking at questions like this. And it was completely bipartisan. It was Republicans, Democrats working together to really question what the right thing to do is in this domain. And there is essentially a quote from Einstein where, and I'm paraphrasing it somewhat, but he made the point that if the world was going to end in 60 minutes, he'd spend 55 minutes on the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. And I can tell you that that is exactly how this challenge was studied. There wasn't this end state of we need to create a new armed force. What the focus on was, how do we have international peace and security? How do we protect this important domain in space? And I think it comes down to, when asking why, the best rationale that I heard after years of looking at this, not only then in Congress, but then in the Pentagon, working as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Space Policy, is that space has become so important that we now needed an armed force to protect and defend it. And space is important for the services that you heard talked about, where soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, international forces and coalitions need these space communication capabilities, observation, timing, and positioning. But also that we now needed a force that was ready for conflict and warfare in the domain, in space. And that is very different than air, land, and sea. And that was ultimately the idea that went forward. I also mentioned the power of a team. And what I learned through that process is the bigger the idea, the bigger the team needed. And this was led by the President of the United States, by Congressman Mike Rogers, by Congressman Jim Cooper. So it was, and many others. And the point is that an idea like this took both sides of the Capitol, where it was the House and the Senate, both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue, Capitol Hill and the White House, and both sides of the Potomac, where it was then the Pentagon and the Department of Defense involved and the interagency. And I say that it's a good case study because I think it's a great instance of how the system's supposed to work, where many parties get together, debate very important ideas, which this took years of debate, and then ultimately a strategic decision was made by leaders to make a change like this. Now, why should you care about space and what else is changing? And I had mentioned the commercial impacts, and I'm going to go through a few aspects here when looking commercially what's happening in space. The first major change is that the cost of launch has come down dramatically. So if you go back to the 1980s or so, when there was the space shuttle program, which provided tremendous capabilities, but it was also very expensive. If you look at just weight getting into orbit, it was about $50,000 per kilogram to get into orbit. If you look at today, with the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, about $1,000 to $2,000 per kilogram. That's a 50 times decrease. So 50 times lower cost to get systems into space. At the same time that's happening, investment in space is going up, not only from governments around the globe, but if we look at private investment, 2022, over $15 billion in private investment going into space. 2021, $7 billion. 2012, 10 years prior to that, less than $1 billion. So there's record-setting investment that's happening now, but it's not just the money, it's what do you do with it. Now, one of the other changes that are happening from a technology perspective is satellites, and what you can do with a satellite is happening in much smaller form factors. And more satellites are being launched. Last year alone, over 1,800 spacecraft launched into orbit. The year before that, 1,200, and before that, 500. So I don't have a graph here to show you, but if I can leave you with a mental image, imagine a curve with this kind of hockey stick growth and acceleration of what's happening in space commercially. Now, this goes across different areas: remote sensing, communication, space domain awareness, space logistics, to name a few. Much of it comes down to data. How are you moving data? How are you processing data? How are you gathering insights from that data? And JP had talked about the global positioning system, generating over $1 trillion of economic activity. These new satellites have yet to unlock that level, but the opportunity is there because new capabilities are being launched every day. My last comments I'll make regarding this and regarding security, as many of you work for governments around the globe, what does this commercial activity mean for security in governments? And there is new activities that are happening here in the United States, and the Department of Defense has started a program called the Hybrid Space Architecture, of the ability to integrate commercial, government, and allied space systems together on common and secure cloud platforms. So how do you bring this tremendous capability together to forces around the globe? So it's an exciting time, and there's rapid change happening. I'm excited to be part of it and look forward to your questions.